Welcome to the Boat Sheet. Today we're going to look at one of the problems that gets discussed quite a lot on some of the forums, and that is which cleat should you use for your first line ashore when you're docking. If you find this video helpful, please remember to click subscribe to help us make more like it. So, the first rule of boating is that wind and tide are never helpful. Here you are coming ashore onto a pontoon where you have to moor with the wind and the tide pushing you off. Your approach is absolutely perfect, but if you don't do something quite quickly when you get there, then you know what's going to happen next. What we need to do then is to make sure that we get a line or two ashore without delay once we're alongside the dock. The question is, which line is best? Some people like to get a bow line on first, and with a twin engine motorboat that can be arguable. Others prefer to get a stern line on first, and if you're single handing and don't want to leave the controls or the helm, that's also arguable. What about the third option though, which is to rig a midline even if you're not planning to use it to moor later? A great cheat is to always imagine what's going to happen next if you fumble the next part of the job. So you can't get it in gear, your engine fails, or you fumble getting that other line on. What happens then? Well, let's look at what happens with the bow line. The current and the wind push you off, and at very least you're going to struggle to get the other lines on, and if your cleats are further aft than I've drawn them here, you've also got a great risk of damaging the bow. With the stern line, things aren't much better. Again, you've got a risk of damage if the cleats aren't as close to the transom as I've drawn them here, and you'll certainly have more of a problem getting other lines ashore. The midline though, let's imagine now if we do nothing else, the engine's failed, we fumble our other lines, what happens now? You can literally have a cup of tea and then step off at the shrouds and connect the bow line and the stern line at your leisure. It's so much more stress-free. This is a great cheat. Surely though, if you get it into gear, everything's going to be right. Well, not necessarily. Here we have the bow line attached, we've got it into gear and we're putting aft power on. Actually, in this case, if the wind and the current are even moderate, the most likely scenario is this is what happens next. Let's have a look at the forces involved and see why this happens. This boat now has got the centre of gravity marked on it just about where the keel is. We've got our thrust line from our engine down the centre of that line, and you can see that with the line on the forecleat, the attachment point on the dock is actually only just right of the centre line of the boat. This means that you have a very, very small turning moment created by engine thrust. The current though and the wind, they're pushing on the middle of the boat at its centre of gravity more or less. That's much further from that forward cleat, and so they've got a really big turning moment, and this is much more than you can overcome with the engine. The result's inevitable. With the stern line, things aren't a great deal better. Here we're in gear, and this time because we're in forward drive we've also got some effort from the rudder. But even with modest power, if there's a moderate tide and moderate wind, the outcome is pretty predictable. Even with modest engine power, the tide and the current will overcome the forces from the rudder and the propeller, and you'll be pushed away from the dock. Let's have a look at those forces to understand why. We have our propeller thrust acting down the centre line of the boat. We've got rudder force acting across the transom, but we've also got the attachment point at the aft cleat. So if the aft cleat is behind the rudder centre of force, then what happens is the rudder will actually be pushing the bow to port, not to starboard. If you're lucky and your rudder's further aft, maybe behind the transom, then you'll get a very small force the other way, turning the bow to starboard. However, the wind and the tide are pushing at the middle of the boat, and that's a long way from that aft cleat. So you'll have a much bigger force pushing the bow out to port and pushing the centre of the boat to port as well. Obviously, there's a small distance from the cleat to the centre line, so you will have a bit of force pushing the bow back to starboard if you put more throttle on. So increasing power could get you somewhere towards matching that power from the wind and the tide, but only if they're really quite light. With the mid cleat on though and the engine in gear, what you now have is the boat moving forwards, and because of that rudder, the boat moving bow towards the dock. So now it's really easy to put a bow line on. You could do it the other way around and go astern and bring the stern towards the dock. Then it's easy to put the transom line on. Let's look at why. Again, we have our thrust line down the centre of the boat and we've got our rudder acting across the transom of the boat. But now, because they're a long way from that mid-cleat, what we'll find is that the turning moment created by the two of them is much greater. The boat's at its widest at the shrouds, where the mid-cleat is, and so there's a much bigger turning moment from the engine thrust because it's further away from where the line's attached. Likewise, the rudder's a long way from the mid-cleat, so that gives you a big turning moment too. Combine these two and you have a very big turning moment created by the combination of engine thrust and rudder. At the same time, the wind and the current are acting around about the centre of the boat. They're almost exactly where the boat's attached, so they have little or no effect at all on the attitude of the boat. If they move slightly forward or slightly aft, the forces are still quite small. So it makes the boat easy to control. What about modern boats with broad transoms? Yeah, they do break some of the rules some of the time. Kaniklani is the Sun Odyssey 349 and our berth doesn't suffer from a strong tide. So when the wind's moderate or up to moderate, I can put the stern line on, power against that, and because of the wide transom I can bring the centre of the boat in close to the dock and then put the other lines on. However, it is limited and it certainly wouldn't work in a strong current or a very strong wind. Let's take a look at the forces then. We have the prop thrust down the centre line of the boat. Unfortunately, because of twin rudders, the sideways thrust from the rudders is non-existent because there's no prop wash, so we have to remove that. So with no actual tidal current affecting the mooring, with that aft cleat tied on, the windage is still acting on the middle of the boat. Air's a lot less dense than water though, so the forces are smaller, but with that large distance you still get quite a moderate turning moment pushing the bow out to port. However, I've got about 1.75 metres of distance between the centre line and the cleat, and I can produce enough turning moment to overcome that with modest engine power. If you're single-handing and don't want to leave the cockpit, there is a better way, and that's to rig a line from the cockpit through the mid-cleat and bring it back around outside everything and have it at the transom ready to put onto a cleat. We need to put a bowline in the end of this line and we need to make sure that it can't come off the mid-cleat, and to do that we pass it through the cleat rather than around it. So we take it through under the legs of the cleat, put a bowline on it, and then we attach it to a boat hook. To see how to do that, watch the boat hook bowline video on this channel. To use this cheat, you'll need to allow time to rig the line through the cleat and attach a bowline to the boat hook before you get near the dock. Now all we do is come back towards the dock astern, ferry gliding if necessary across on the current, and put ourselves close to the cleat where the midline is going to be attached. Put the engine in neutral and then using the boat hook, place the bowline loop around the cleat. There's no rush to do this because the boat hook's quite long, so you have plenty of time. Once you've done that, pull the boat hook out of the bowline and take up the slack before oxoing off on the aft cleat. To see how to do the oxo, check out our oxo video. Then power against it with idle power or a little bit above that and see what happens next. Because the boat's being pivoted at the centre cleat, you've got good control. All you now need to do is put the engine in reverse. Undo the oxo with the other hand and take up the slack as you move aft, then put the oxo back on that aft cleat, put it back into forward gear and pull forward again. Once more you're pivoting on that middle cleat, and so the bow comes round further into the wind and into the current, pulls you back against the dock. Again into astern. When you go astern, undo the oxo with the other hand, take up the slack as you go aft, and then put the oxo back on again. This cheat allows you to get alongside single-handed in just about any boat, in just about any wind and current conditions. I hope you found that useful. If so, please subscribe, and if you want to know about our next videos, don't forget to hit the notification bell.